In this video, I will explain the balance project. It is an important project. There's a lot to learn from it, but it requires more of an explanation than most projects. Learning how to balance graphic design is essential. There's two key terms that come up in this project, and that is symmetrical composition and an asymmetrical composition. Now, let me just show you an actual example from the project first. The one on the left is symmetrical, and it's symmetrical across this axis. More on that later. This is an asymmetrical design. Now, in the category of symmetrical, let me just say for this project, your symmetrical design must be perfectly mirror reflection symmetrical. But in order to explain how this applies to actual graphic design, let's look at a couple examples, and I'll point out the ones that are actually symmetrical versus the ones that are implied symmetrical. So here, a lot of logos are symmetrical across an axis, in this case the vertical axis here. So same stuff on the left side is on the right side. But most of the time, once you add type underneath the logo, like Batman Corporation, then it's no longer truly symmetrical. But if Batman and Corporation are equally on each side of the bat, then it's still implied symmetry. Like here's one that is very implied symmetrical, but if you draw a line down the middle here, what's on the left and what's on the right is not 100% identical. But generally, as a graphic designer, looking at pieces like this, we would say that this is a symmetrical design, or at least implied symmetrical. So just know that actual graphic design projects that are symmetrical are probably in the lesser category. Ones that are truly symmetrical are very few and far between, unless it's maybe just a logo by itself. But then there's a few, like I just showed you, that have implied symmetrical or implied symmetry. So they have nearly the same object size and weight on each side of an axis. And most of the time we're going to be talking about a vertical axis. But more designs out there are probably asymmetrical, or at least are mostly asymmetrical. Asymmetrical designs are generally more interesting and show off your skills. So you definitely don't want to load up a portfolio with a bunch of symmetrical designs, because the key thing is it's easy to balance out a symmetrical design. You just put roughly the same amount of stuff on the left side as the right side, and it tends to take care of itself. Here's a couple good examples of very asymmetrical designs, meaning there's not even a lot of implied symmetry. So this one right here, what's on the left of, where do we even find the axis? I guess it would be right about here. So truly not a mirror reflection. Same thing with this one, totally different stuff going on than the left to the right. This one, if you really searched, you could find some implied symmetry. If you go across the axis here, you could say, well, for this big A, there's this big multicolored box that balances it out. This and this, though not truly symmetrical, are definitely implied symmetrical. Here's a great asymmetrical design. Almost all of the content is on the left. How does that work? How does that not feel out of balance? Well, you have this big chunk of white space that offers an amount of weight, visual weight as well. I will show you some examples, and they'll also be contained within the project description on Canvas from this website. But I just want you to know that there's one of them on there, depending on what semester you're watching this, that no longer meets the new minimum requirements that I've made. Okay, so under student work, 2D design, balance project. There are 3 examples on here. You might be thinking, I count 6, but this is one example, this is another example, this is another example. And this symmetrical composition does not have 3 colors, and 3 colors is now a requirement on this project. What I'm going to do is work with 3 pairs in Illustrator to help explain the project, but I want to stress, as you'll see on the instruction sheet in a second here, this project is done by hand. You will not do it in any type of computer program. I think that you learn more from it when you do it on paper. And I'll kind of start more broad and then I'll define some terms, although we already have sort of defined symmetrical and asymmetrical. So these are the same instructions you'll find if you click on the link in Canvas that takes you to the project. So here we go. You will create 2 compositions. The first one will be symmetrical and the second one will be asymmetrical. However, both will be balanced. The final size of each is 12 by 12 inches. However, do not mount these on a mat board. I mean, you could put any kind of board you want or paper or whatever as the very bottom of it, but there will be no border whatsoever. If you take a ruler to the final project, it will measure 12 inches wide by 12 inches tall. We will start with a session where you just show thumbnails for the project to show me that you understand, but let's take care of these things that we just talked about by looking at examples here. So if we were to measure the actual project that this student completed, it would be 12 inches by 12 inches. The student did one that is symmetrical and one that is asymmetrical. Here's another student example, symmetrical on the left, asymmetrical on the right, all cut from construction paper and glued together. And here is a third example, and what I did was I just modified the one that I showed you earlier and put yellow on here. So symmetrical, asymmetrical. You may use only circles, triangles, or rectangles on this project. However, they may be overlapped to create new shapes. For example, you may look at this shape and say, well, that's not a rectangle or a triangle, but actually, if you think about it, there is a triangle just simply added to a rectangle. And you do not need to put that down on the piece of paper as 2 separate pieces of paper. Just basically anything that could be made by combining circles, rectangles, and triangles is allowed on this project. Both of the compositions will be non-representational. So do not make, like goofy faces or try to mimic a road or, anything like that. You're just making a composition that is to serve the purpose of learning by doing, by making one that is symmetrical and one that is asymmetrical. Now, when you're done, somebody may look at it and say, that reminds me of something. And me being a musician and being into art, this reminds me of some of the early stuff that Picasso did where he would make guitars and deconstruct them. But that's not to take away from what this student did. It just happens to look like that. So as you'll see, nothing in these examples looks like, you can't say, oh, well, you can say it reminds you of something, but none of these students started out to make anything in particular, which is exactly what I want and what helps you learn the most. 3 to 4 colors will be used. Black and white is included in that number. So if you use black, white, and red, you'd be at your minimum. If you added one more color to that, like yellow, you would be at your maximum. You do not have to use white or black, but the only thing you just have to meet is using at least 3, but no more than 4 different colors. The composition must have a vertical axis of symmetry, bilateral symmetry may also be used. So let me explain that with the examples. So this composition has and only has symmetry across this vertical line. So I've made a line here. If we put it right in the middle, basically what you have to do is just pretend that this line is a mirror and that what is on the left is reflected over to the right. Sometimes it helps you to see it better if they're actually dissected. So you can see this left half and this right half. I pulled them apart here, but the left half is to the right half a mirror reflection. So this area here where the red triangle barely touches the blue edge, mirror reflection all the way over to the outer edge here, same exact thing is going on. And that is the only requirement of symmetry. Now, it just so happens that sometimes people's designs are also symmetrical. In addition to across the vertical, they are also symmetrical across the horizontal. I grade your project either mentally or physically, sometimes with a ruler. I'll put them on the project and I'll say, okay, is the left half and the right half a mirror reflection? Yep, great. And then I might also just make a mental note, hey, wait a minute. Also, the top and the bottom just so happen to be a reflection of each other as well. The other example here looks like, well, it definitely meets the requirements this way, and it looks like if we divide it this way, that it also just so happens to be symmetrical across the horizontal axis. Now let me give you kind of a test, make sure you understand. So let me ask you two questions. One, is this design symmetrical? And two, would it meet the requirements for this project? And you can pause and see if you can answer that, probably should. So the answer is yes, it is symmetrical because the bottom and the top are completely symmetrical across this horizontal axis that I'm making with my mouse right now. However, it does not meet the requirements for this project because it is not symmetrical across a vertical axis. Now it is. Things to keep in mind are that scale change can make your composition much more interesting. So if you have big shapes in there and small shapes, that tends to look more interesting to most of us humans. Be aware of using equal amounts of colors. That can kind of get mundane and boring. There's an old adage in art that says use a lot of one color, a moderate amount of a second color, and just a touch of a third color to give your composition the most interest. Experiment a lot as you go through this project, especially with the asymmetrical, because that's where you want to learn what it takes to balance the project. And it's going to take experimentation. It's going to take putting those pieces down, moving them around, leaving, getting away, getting out of the room, coming back and looking at it and thinking to yourself, does the composition feel like it's heavier on the left side than the right side? And if so, how do I correct that? Which we will talk about techniques for doing just that in an upcoming video. In here is the biggest challenge to you is try to make more than one color act as the figure and more than one color act as the background, so that there doesn't appear to be a true background and a true foreground. And if we look at some of these examples, if we look at this one, we can say, well, I kind of want to say that black is the background, although you could make an argument that blue is the background and they cut this shape out of it. So this one does a pretty good job of that. This one, you want to say that blue is the background here. Had they made the shapes go right to the edge, then you might be fighting for, is green the background Or is black the background? Both of these do a great job of fooling you because they could have started